Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining Duke Science and Society for the 11th installment of our coronavirus conversations. My name is Tim McDermott, and I am the events manager at Duke Science and Society. So just a few housekeeping notes before I hand it over to today's moderator for our conversation. The chat is open, and we encourage you to post questions you would like for our panelists to answer. You can send them to either myself, Timothy McDermott, I think it's listed there as, or Ben Shepard. Either one of those folks can handle your questions and we'll send them on to our moderator. Should you experience any technical difficulties and you get booted from the meeting for any reason, all you have to do is go back to your email and check out the link that I sent you and you can log right back in, shouldn't have any problems. The last thing is I want to remind everyone to head over to the Duke Science and Society website to check out our next coronavirus conversation, which is next week, May 22nd, when we will discuss thriving and surviving as a STEM graduate student during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've got a great panel lined up for that, and our own Jory Weintraub is going to moderate that. While you are there, you can also check out our master's program where our students and our faculty are dealing with the issues that we've discussed throughout the coronavirus conversations on a daily basis. This is what we address in our classrooms, and this is what we address in our publications. One of those publications, Meredith, our moderator today, is intimately involved with, the Journal of Law and Biosciences, correct? Is that correct, Meredith? I realized previously I've gotten the name wrong, but it is the Journal of Law and Biosciences. And you guys just published the coronavirus edition, is that correct?
We have an issue, a special issue on coronavirus law and ethics in the time of a pandemic, but it is sort of updating in real time. So we've still got submissions that we're processing. It's really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's great. And yeah, folks can check that out there. And if we have any, I guess if we have any researchers who want to submit work, are you still accepting submissions, Meredith?
We are still accepting submissions, but we can't guarantee at this time that it'll be fast-tracked for review or publication.
Well, that's great. That's great. So sorry, just wanted to plug that a little bit. That's one of the many things we do here at Science and Society. It's good to let people know all the work that we're doing, especially that Meredith has been doing with this journal, trying to get everything fast-tracked. So with that out of the way, Meredith, obviously I've done a little bit of an introduction. She is a medical sociologist and the postdoctoral associate at the Ferhani Science, Law, and Policy Lab located at Duke Science and Society. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to her to introduce our great panel.
Thank you so much, Tim. So thank you everyone for joining us today over Zoom, and thanks so much to the panelists for making time to speak with us today and share their expertise. The coronavirus pandemic raises important questions about the current US immigration policies, including policies related to detention, asylum, and labor, which is what our panelists will be talking about today. This pandemic is taking place at a time when the federal government has prioritized what it calls a zero tolerance immigration enforcement approach and has instituted dramatic changes to detention, asylum, refugee, and public benefits policies. For example, in February, just as the pandemic started sweeping the United States, the expanded public charge rule went into effect. This rule, which penalizes immigrants seeking to enter the US or applying for a green card if they use certain public benefits, was recently expanded to include vital health, housing, and nutrition benefits. The CARES Act, which provides emergency pandemic relief, also explicitly excludes many immigrants and mixed status families from these benefits. We're also seeing numerous reports indicating that low-wage essential workers, many of whom are immigrants, are facing excessive virus exposure and disproportionately high rates of infection. This includes recent outbreaks in immigrant-supported industries like meat and poultry processing, including in rural areas right here in North Carolina. There have also been reports of COVID-19 outbreaks in prisons and detention centers, and news that migrants with COVID-19 are being removed to their countries of origin while contagious. Prior to the coronavirus pandemic, the existing immigration policy context challenged the health and well-being of many immigrants and mixed status families. But the coronavirus pandemic is exacerbating these conditions and reminding us all that the virus immigration policy is health policy, and in particular, public health policy, as the virus continues to spread through communities and infect people regardless of their immigration status. That's why I'm so grateful to have these expert panelists here today to give us some background on how we got here and what we can do to prioritize public health through immigration policy during and beyond this pandemic. With that, I'll introduce our esteemed panelists very briefly, but I encourage you to check out their impressive CVs and past work as well. We have Kate Evans, who joined Duke Law faculty in 2019 as a clinical professor of law and inaugural director of the new clinic focused on immigration law and policy. Sabrina Ardalan is the director of the Harvard Immigration and Refugee Clinical Program. At the clinic, Ardalan supervises and trains law students working on applications for asylum and other humanitarian protections, as well as appellate litigation and policy advocacy. And finally, Salvador Sarmiento coordinates campaigns and legislative efforts for the 50-member National Day Laborer Organizing Network, NDALAN, accompanying local, state, and national efforts in defense of immigrant and workers' rights. So thank you all again for being here. I'd like to start with Kate and ask you just if you could give us a little bit of background on immigration detention in the US and some of the specific challenges the coronavirus pandemic is posing for detained immigrants.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here with you and with Sabi and with Salvador and participate in the Science and Society conversations that you guys have put together. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, I think that unfortunately, in looking at immigration detention and the impact of the coronavirus, it's no different than sort of any other place where we're seeing the coronavirus both exacerbate, reflect, and reinforce deep inequities, deep injustices. And so within the context of immigration detention, it's laying bare fundamental problems that have been growing for the last 2 decades. As a result, we're seeing court after court state that being held in civil immigration detention during this pandemic can amount to a death sentence, and that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, has been deliberately indifferent to these risks. To explain why our immigration detention policy is a public health problem, I'd like to cover 3 main points. First, our over-reliance on immigration detention generally. Next, the high rates of detention for individuals who pose low risk to public safety and flight, as well as those who are particularly vulnerable. And third, how inadequate healthcare measures in detention centers combined with the high rates of detention endanger us all. So first, it's important to understand the scale of immigration detention in the United States, which is the largest of any detention system in the world. Immigration detention, first off, is not supposed to be punishment. Being present in the United States without authorization is not a crime. The process of determining whether someone is deportable or removable is a civil procedure. And so therefore, the purpose of immigration detention is supposed to be limited to keeping somebody, making sure that somebody does not flee during those proceedings and doesn't harm somebody else while those proceedings are pending. In other words, if a person does not represent a risk of flight or danger to others, they should not be detained during this process. Unfortunately, that's not the reality. ICE relies on more than 200 facilities across the country, including local jails, prisons, detention centers run by the federal government, as well as private companies, to hold an average of 50,000 people every night as of in 2019. And if you include Customs and Border Patrol, that adds as many as 80,000 more people in a given day held by the US government due to their immigration status alone. So in the course of a year, this adds up to nearly 500,000 people in civil immigration detention. The system is costly, as one might expect, and ICE reports that it costs about $130 a night to detain somebody, and they received a staggering $3.2 billion in 2019 to run its massive detention operation. So who is getting detained? Again, we're talking about people suspected of violating our civil immigration laws, not individuals charged with crimes. And though civil detention is supposed to be the exception, not the norm in the United States, it's not the case with immigration enforcement. Instead, we see the systematic detention of individuals who pose a low risk of flight and danger and who are particularly vulnerable to harm in custody. So in the next couple of weeks, I'm publishing the findings of some lengthy FOIA litigation jointly with Robert Coolish from the University of Maryland. And these findings describe how ICE's system for assessing risk of flight and dangerousness was manipulated over time so that fewer and fewer individuals were evaluated as low risk and recommended for release. The system eliminated the relevance of many community ties and increased the weight given to low-level offenses so that factors that once rendered someone a low risk generated medium and high risk labels instead. As a result, people who have family ties and minimal or no criminal history were still recommended for detention. The system was also changed to eliminate the recommendation that ICE release people on bond. And so ultimately, ICE's screening system does not tie detention to risk. When we looked at the results of approximately 30,000 cases in New York between 2016 and 2019, we saw that ICE released only a handful of individuals and allowed release on bond for very few cases. And consequently, ICE detained nearly everyone it encountered. Even as the risk assessment labeled more and more people as medium or high risks, so that a low risk assessment was difficult to obtain, the proportion of total people detained who even ICE labeled as low risk climbed to 30%. Additionally, the risk assessment system was supposed to screen individuals for special vulnerabilities and who were therefore more likely to be harmed by detention itself and designate them for potential release. This has not played out. ICE reported early on that nearly 2/3 of people with identified vulnerabilities were detained anyway, even though their detention was not required. So that even when ICE identifies someone likely to be harmed by detention, that person is often not released. The screening tool itself is ineffective. In New York, we saw only 4% of individuals identified with a vulnerability, and courts and former ICE officials have identified fundamental shortcomings in the screening system. So at bottom, we have widespread detention of people because of their immigration status alone, regardless of their risk or vulnerability. And this is combined with ICE's long-standing failure to safeguard the people it detains. And the coronavirus has made these failures all the more apparent. People are forced to live in close quarters with shared bathrooms, sinks, telephones, tables. These are jails, they're simply jails. And social distancing is not possible in this context. There's poor ventilation, so there's really no meaningful way to isolate someone with COVID-19, even if that person is identified. There are limited on-site medical services and historically inadequate medical care across ICE's detention facilities. So that unfortunately, even before the pandemic hit, immigration detention could result in death. And nearly 200 people have died in immigration detention since 2004. So we see a system ill-equipped to deal with the current pandemic, and that's exactly what we're seeing play out in court. Court after court is finding that people held in detention centers have limited access to testing and masks. Staff aren't required to wear masks. ICE does not enforce regular disinfecting at facilities. And ICE had not been identifying or protecting people at particularly high risk of death or long-term disability from COVID-19. As a result, and unfortunately not surprisingly, as of 3 weeks ago, ICE reported that nearly 870 people had tested positive for the coronavirus across 41 separate facilities. And that's based on testing only 5% of those people it detains, with 50% of them testing positive. So many more people are likely to have the virus, and a number of court cases has shown that ICE simply has no procedure to detect asymptomatic cases and has limited its testing even when people do exhibit symptoms. In the face of these inadequate measures, courts have been requiring ICE to release certain individuals and to review everyone who is detained for risk factors and evaluate whether they should be released in order to protect them. Advocates are also raising challenges to detention regardless of the heightened medical risk, arguing that no one can be safe in detention particularly given the context of detention and the fact that the data on the risk factors and the impact of the disease continues to evolve. This release, unfortunately, is not happening fast enough, though, as ICE saw the first COVID-19 death in custody last week. That individual had been identified for review, but unfortunately was not released in time. And the current policies mean that immigration detention can be a death sentence. But these risks are not limited to those detained. More than 40 ICE staff members at detention centers have tested positive. Guards and contractors are going in and out of the facilities on a regular basis and are in contact with others in their community. Individuals are transferred to different facilities throughout the country. As a result, for example, community members surrounding a Texas detention facility are now asking questions about how this pandemic is being managed, as they see an increase in cases because of the local immigration detention center. The over-reliance on detention also diverts billions of dollars away from investment in testing and essential medical equipment that could protect everyone from COVID-19. To me, what's most telling is the reduction in immigration detention that we're seeing taking place now, because it shows that thousands of individuals did not need to be detained. As of the end of April, ICE had released 900 people as part of its COVID-19 review, and it reported a reduction of 7,000 people in detention over the course of March and April. ICE is now detaining fewer than 30,000 people, down from a high of 56,000. These measures show that thousands of people never should have been detained in the first place. And in fact, a former ICE director called for the release of thousands of nonviolent, low flight risk detainees currently in ICE custody in order to protect communities across the country from the spread of coronavirus. We have alternatives to detention which are effective at assuring attendance in immigration court while allowing people to care for their health and their families. They cost a fraction of the amount spent on detention, and they include electronic monitoring, periodic phone calls, in-person reporting, and home visits. These alternatives to detention result in a 99% attendance rate in court. As many have said already, we are all in this together. By protecting the most vulnerable, all of us are safer. And this means releasing thousands of people who are unnecessarily detained so that we can protect our communities and invest in our collective health. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that. I will be asking follow-up questions later, I'm sure, but I want to give Sabi a chance to talk about Asylum. If you could tell us a little bit about the current asylum situation and how the pandemic is impacting prospective asylees.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored also to be part of this panel. And I thought I would just start with giving a little bit of context for what our asylum system requires here in the US. And then I'm going to focus on 3 specific ways that the pandemic is affecting asylum seekers, although it's affecting asylum seekers in a myriad of ways. So by way of context, the US has a longstanding obligation under international law, under domestic law, to provide protection to refugees who are fleeing serious human rights violations in their home countries. Under the 1980 Refugee Act, we have to safeguard the rights of people who have either suffered persecution in their home countries or who have a well-founded fear of persecution in their home countries. Despite these legal obligations, the administration is taking steps to eviscerate asylum seekers' protections under US law, and those efforts are combining with the pandemic to wreak havoc for asylum seekers. So the first way that this is happening is with a recent order that was issued by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and a rule that was promulgated that effectively allows for expulsion of asylum seekers who are coming to the US. And in just a few short weeks, over 200,000 people have been expelled from the US, including 20,000 people, including 400 kids, without anybody screening them for a fear of return to their home countries. So these 20,000 people, many of them may well have fears of return to their home countries. Their lives may be in danger if returned to their home countries. These 400 kids, may suffer serious harm, torture, death, and yet the US failed to comply with its obligations under domestic law to screen them to see whether or not they had a fear of return, and just expelled them without assessing them. And those actions are clearly inconsistent with our obligations to asylum seekers under US law. The administration has invoked public health as the reason for these expulsions, yet there are many other ways of addressing public health concerns under the pandemic and safeguarding asylum seekers' rights. So the administration could screen individual applicants for illness, could quarantine them, could isolate them while they screen them. A categorical ban on asylum seekers, a categorical, measure that's expelling people without any form of screening isn't the right approach, and isn't safeguarding public health in any way. It's just a new way that this administration is trying to stop asylum seekers from coming to the US, rather than a way of effectively protecting public health. The second way in which the administration's efforts are combining with the pandemic to wreak havoc on asylum seekers' lives is in the context of the health of asylum seekers. So Kate described in detail how dire the situation is in detention. Many asylum seekers are detained. So one of my clients who's seeking asylum came to the US, presented at the southern border, and explained that he was scared of being returned to his home country. He was automatically put in detention. He's been there for 16 months. And all he's trying to do is establish that he's scared to go home to his home country. And that means that now he's in a dorm with 60 people in bunk beds, and is terrified that he's going to catch COVID-19. So, in the detention context, asylum seekers' lives are at stake. And for asylum seekers who aren't detained, the same is true. So there are over 60,000 asylum seekers who are currently forced to wait at the US border in Mexico to have their day in US immigration court under a policy that this administration has put into place that's informally known as the Remain in Mexico policy. There's no reason people need to be waiting in tent cities at the Mexico border for their day in US immigration court. Many people have close friends and family who would take them in here in the US. They could be paroled into the US, allowed to reunite with those friends and families to wait for their day in immigration court in much safer circumstances, rather than waiting in what are often tent cities along the border, where there is no mechanism for social distancing, where people are already subjected to kidnappings, to attacks, to extortion, ransom, and whose lives are already in danger because of this policy. And the pandemic is only making that situation worse for them. For those asylum seekers who are here in the US who aren't detained, the situation is also very grim. So many asylum seekers, because of the anti-immigrant rhetoric that this administration has constantly pushed out, are scared to seek healthcare that they need. They're scared to access the services that they need. So a former client's daughter called me frantically because her mom was really, really sick, and she was scared to call 911. And thankfully she's on the mend, but many people are too scared to access the services that they need and that they have a right to while they're waiting for their day in immigration court, while they're waiting for their asylum claims to be heard here. And that's because of the fear that this administration has sown in these immigrant communities. Many of my clients who are seeking asylum work in jobs that don't allow them to socially distance. They are childcare providers. They work in nursing homes. They work in grocery stores. Many of my clients live in some of the communities that are hardest hit in this country, in Chelsea, which is a community here in Boston, in the Boston area, where the rates of COVID-19 are really high. And that the virus has put into stark relief the fundamental flaws in our healthcare system, in our safety net, and the systemic and structural racism that permeates it, that results in disproportionately higher death rates for people of color, of immigrants, of our clients. So, you know, I think it's important to keep in mind that whether these asylum seekers win their cases and stay here in the US, or if they're forced to return to their home countries, they'll have a higher chance of having caught and spreading COVID-19 due to these policies. And then the third way in which asylum seekers are really suffering because of the pandemic is because of additional barriers that the pandemic is creating to presenting their claims for protection here in the US. So it's really hard to win asylum here in the US. In some courts, the grant rates are as low as 1 or 2%. You know, even without the pandemic, the system is stacked against people who are seeking asylum. There's a right to an attorney, but it's at your own expense. Many people don't have attorneys. Most people don't have attorneys. And right now, it's even harder to get legal representation because legal services organizations, many of them have closed intake, many of them aren't taking new cases. Lawyers are forced to work in remote circumstances, which makes preparing cases much harder. And yet, you know, the administration is marching forward with immigration court filing deadlines remaining in place, with detained immigration court hearings going forward, with deportations going forward. And so, you know, all of the barriers to preparing and presenting an effective case in immigration court have been ramped up exponentially. So often asylum filings are hundreds, if not thousands of pages long. If you have counsel and you're lucky enough to be able to fully present your case in court, pulling together that kind of a filing right now puts everyone's health at risk. It requires asylum seekers to tell their whole life stories in the form of a declaration, in the form of testimony, and preparing an asylum seeker to testify in immigration court is really hard under these circumstances. Preparing a declaration to file is really hard, especially when people have suffered, often suffered extreme trauma, and forcing them to open up about that under these circumstances is really challenging. Asylum seekers have a 1-year filing deadline to apply for asylum here in the US. Meeting that deadline during this pandemic is really difficult. And so, you know, as these immigration court proceedings go forward, as detention and deportation keeps marching forward, it's putting people's lives at risk, and asylum seekers are very much at risk because of this.
Thank you so much for all that information. It's a you know, serious, and I think we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more in detail about that. But I want to give Salvador the chance to also update us on the situation for workers. Salvador, could you give us a sense for some of the unique challenges that are facing immigrant workers and some of the workers that your organization works with during this pandemic?
Sure. Thank you, Meredith, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Thanks to my fellow panelists, Kate, Sabi, and thanks Tim for doing all the things that need to happen for this to take place. I think as Sabi and as Kate have been mentioning, everything is, all the dangers, all the risks, all the givens that we already knew before this, in a sense, are heightened during any epidemic, more so during a pandemic. And for low-wage workers, and specifically for immigrant workers, and more specifically for undocumented workers, all of the layers of vulnerabilities are exacerbated. And so if we can imagine what the world looked like six months ago, if it's difficult, but if we try to remember what it looked like 6 months ago, day laborers. We're the National Day Labor Organizing Network. We work with day laborers and low wage, mostly low wage undocumented workers in similar kind of precarious work situations. 6 months ago, immigrant workers were already dealing with at least two crises. One is kind of an economic crisis, and there was already signs, especially at the beginning of the year, signs of what was possibly a recession. Nobody knew for sure, but definitely there was already signs that work was decreasing. That's one. And then a second crisis that we were all dealing with is really a crisis, a political crisis of an ascendancy of what is really white nationalist political movement in this country, that day laborers, that immigrant people of color live with and confront on a day-to-day basis, from everything from abuse at work to hate crimes, to the violence from local, state, and federal actors. So that was already two crises that immigrant workers were dealing with. On top of that, the pandemic of coronavirus really compounds those two crises with this new health crisis. And so it's, in a sense, it's a perfect storm for immigrant workers that are dealing with what is an economic crisis, what is a political crisis, and now what is a health crisis. And as Sabi and Kate were saying, there should be no doubt in anyone's mind that the people that are running the White House today don't care if people die in this moment. Like the suffering that moves us, it doesn't move the people that are in the White House right now. So it's important it shouldn't be controversial at this moment. And definitely, I think for health professionals, it's evident, it's clear, and we kind of have to respond accordingly. So when we think about kind of the situation that immigrant workers are in, I'll make 3 points. It's when you think of, for example, specifically day laborers, if, just to be really specific, look for work on a day-to-day basis. Day workers, day laborers, in construction, in service industries, domestic workers, gardeners. If for some of them have more regular work, but for the most part, we're talking about millions of workers across the country that if they don't go out to a Home Depot, to a 7-Eleven, to a paint store to look for work on a day-to-day basis, they will not have, money to pay for food a week from now. Some of them 2 or 3 days from now, right? So already that is an extremely vulnerable segment of workers. So you can imagine what it means when mayors and governors and the federal government is asking individuals to stay home and not to go to work, shutting businesses down. Even for workers that want to comply, they're in a sense in a great dilemma where, they're told to stay home, but they know that if, staying home means that they will not have enough money to eat, to provide for their children at times. So there's a dilemma that a lot of day laborers and low wage workers are placed in when they're told to stay home. But as Meredith stated at the beginning of the presentation, but they're also excluded from the cash assistance from the stimulus that really allows people that don't have a disposable income, that don't have extra money in a bank account to stay home. So when we say that workers were already vulnerable, that means already vulnerable, from broad exclusion. That means from cases of wage theft, and all those vulnerabilities again become exacerbated during this moment. When we've been hearing about a lot of the larger, more profile cases of factories, large factories, specifically ones connected to the food supply chain, being, places of hotspots, they say, of contagion, where they're, made to work very close together. When you think about some of these factories where workers are in some cases made to wear adult diapers, because of the lack of power that workers have, they're forced basically by their employers to wear diapers because they don't have time to take breaks, because they don't have time to use the restroom and things like that. It really gives you an idea of how a lot of some of these employers, and definitely the government officials, view these workers as disposable. And so those are the more high profile factories that have been in the news. Even in those high profile factories, many of these companies are continuing to move forward to force these workers to risk their health, just, without the appropriate protective gear. Those are the ones that have gotten more attention. Now, imagine a day laborer center, maybe a block or right outside of a Home Depot. These are workers. Imagine when I think of some of the men that I work with, that we speak to, for example, at the Pasadena Job Center in right there in North Carolina, in Carborough, the worker centers in New York City and New Jersey. Some of these workers are 50, 60, 70 years old. So if you think about your grandfather, or your father, if he's in his 60s or 70s, there's no way for that person to stay home. And if they have no income, no savings to be able to stay home, think about a grandfather of 70 years having to go out to a Home Depot to stand on the corner, whether it's cold, whether it's hot, and literally stand outside of a Home Depot, maybe with a mask if they're fortunate enough to have a mask, and literally, as cars drive by, to lift up their hands because they're trying to get a day's work and a day's pay. That's outrageous. And I think, especially for health professionals, through a health lens, to see that the federal response, and for the most part, the state response, and for the most part, the city response, has been to replicate the federal exclusion of this entire segment of workers from our public health response, is completely outrageous. And it doesn't make sense. I think for public health professionals, you cannot have an enormous segment of the population arbitrarily excluded, just absent from a public health response, and think that that public health response is going to be effective and complete. It just doesn't make sense. And in a sense, the same way that coronavirus and the pandemic heightens the risks and the dangers for everybody, it also makes clear some of the givens that we have in this moment. And so, for example, it makes it clear how absurd, some of the notions behind Trumpism really are, when, especially from a public health lens, when you think about, a wall is going to protect, anybody from a pandemic. The coronavirus does not care whether you live on this side or that side of the bridge in New York City, whether you live in New York State or New Jersey. It doesn't matter. The pandemic has really made it clear that whether some of these state officials like it or not, we're all eating from the same table. It is migrant workers that are picking our food, that are bringing our food to our tables. So those are kind of the givens that were the case already. It makes it all the more obvious how regressive and backwards and anti-scientific this Trumpism and these notions have been. And so in a sense, that as frustrating, as painful as it is to see that these workers and these neighbors, these loved ones, have been excluded, definitely from the workforce, but also I think the same goes for individuals that are in ICE custody, refugees and asylum seekers. As painful as it is that these individuals have been excluded, definitely from the federal response, and sadly also from much of the state responses, the moment also creates an opening that, because it is so obvious, it is so evident how absurd it is to ignore and exclude such an enormous segment of people from our communities, from our society. It also creates an opportunity for us to make a point and to make a political demand about what we need to do to respond accordingly.
Thank you so much for sharing all that information. I know that we've kind of laid out a lot of sort of severe and bleak circumstances right now, but this is the nature of the pandemic in many ways. And I do have some follow-up questions, but in the interest of time, I'd like to kind of pivot toward, given the challenges that you've mentioned, what are some of the opportunities that you see? And I would like to pose this to everyone. And you can say a little bit more if there was something you wanted to add to your previous comments, but what are some of the opportunities that you see? Let's start with at the federal level for improvements through immigration policy or labor policy that might optimize public health in this time of crisis. Let's start with Kate, and then we'll just sort of go to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think briefly, and I do agree that we're seeing the devastating impact of the disease on immigration detention. We're also seeing advocates and national organizations move mountains to bring these issues to light and to increasingly create this body of documents that show how inadequate immigration detention is. That's, all the worse in the pandemic, but certainly not starting there. And so I do think that there are there is more attention to these conditions that have, that people have been speaking out about for a long time. But folks can start to understand in terms of, the personal risk that they're trying to manage every day and how that's just not even possible in these settings. I do think, there is just way too much detention. There's detention of thousands of people who should not be there. And so, federally, I think that we simply have to eliminate the massive immigration detention system. There's study after study that shows that we can do this in a better, cheaper way. We need those resources spent elsewhere. And so we're not getting anything from our, from taxpayer dollars. We're imposing, terrific harm on individuals. Where as Salvador says, there's this dehumanization that is devastating and really hard to think about as what our country is doing. And I think we're seeing ICE, essentially have to admit that, yeah, tens of thousands of people never should have been there. And that just needs to continue.
Thank you. Sabi.
Yeah, I completely agree with Kate. I think releasing people from detention is priority number one in this pandemic, especially. And I think along with that is a halt to immigration enforcement. People's fears of being picked up by immigration and put in detention are what are driving people from not seeking the care they need, from not seeking the services they need, and are making our communities sicker. And so the federal government has in its power to halt immigration enforcement during this pandemic, and it's something that it very much should do. I think there have also been calls by advocates, by immigration judges for at least a temporary halt to immigration court proceedings, to a halt to filing deadlines. It imposes extraordinary pressures on people to go forward with their cases in court right now, to try to prepare to present an asylum claim, to talk about their entire trauma history under these circumstances, and the federal government can take steps to put a halt to those proceedings, and to release people from detention, and to stop putting people into the deportation machine.
Thank you. Salvador, anything that you think at the federal level can be done before we turn to talking to more state and local responses?
Sure. I think that it's important that when we think about what can we do, for better or for worse, it is important that we start with where the federal government is at, because so much of this ongoing exclusion begins because of a huge failure of the federal government that has literally excluded a generation of undocumented immigrants for decades. Currently, they're on, I think, depends how you count them, the fourth or the fifth COVID response piece of legislation. And this last round, finally, the Democratic House included a bill that actually does include many of the things that we were asking for, at least on the emergency assistance side. It includes an extension for TPS holders. It includes an extension for DACA recipients. It includes what they call an ITIN fix. So people that have paid taxes using an ITIN will be eligible for stimulus cash relief. So that's good. The fact is that, number one, folks would, even with this nicer bill, in the Democratic House, folks would still be excluded. And it still doesn't include everything, including in terms of for people in detention. All it does is basically restate what litigators are already forcing ICE to do. So even in the nice bill that is being moved in the House, in terms of the ask to release everybody, this last bill that I think just 24 hours ago they're talking about, all it does is restate what litigators are already forcing ICE to do. So it's a big question about whether, there actually is a political commitment to get any of these demands across the finish line. Like Sabi and Kate were saying, there is a lot that ideally could happen at the federal level. To date, none of that has happened. And it's a big question about why, including the funding for ICE enforcement. In the 4 years of the Trump administration, funding has just gone up to the point where, as Kate said earlier, we have 50,000 people in ICE migrant prison camps. 50,000 people. Before COVID, we had 60,000 refugees at the border blocked, not through Remain in Mexico, MPP, right? So these aren't small segments of the population. These are enormous, huge hundreds and thousands of people we're talking about being excluded by the federal government. And it's a big question about why the Democratic House and Republicans, of course, also haven't put up almost any resistance at the federal level.
Thank you for that response. And sort of thinking about what you've said, each of you, I'd like to, consider now what are some of the more state level and local level responses that might be effective in prioritizing immigrants' health and thus the public health at large. Thinking about both policies you would like to see and also resources that exist and you might want to share with some of the audience members that you're aware of. We'll start with, maybe we'll go backwards at this point, or maybe I'll start in the middle. How about Sabi, if you could start this time?
Sure. I do think one source of hope for me and inspiration is just what a huge outpouring of support for immigrant community members that there has been at the local level here in Massachusetts. So we've seen groups come together to raise tremendous amounts of money for undocumented folks who aren't eligible for certain benefits. There are local efforts to provide people who've paid into the tax system who don't have social security numbers with resources. The mutual aid networks locally have really come together to have neighborhoods support one another so that people can indicate what their needs are and then receive help in those ways. There are, small like community-based organizations that are conducting food drives and helping our clients connect with fill their basic food needs. People who are collecting diapers for individuals who can't get access to them. So, these small grassroots ways in which communities have really come together are I think one real source of hope in these tough times.
Thank you. Salvador, do you have any kind of local level responses?
Sure, I think that's really where the energy and the traction has been. If folks have gotten released, if folks have received some assistance, it's because folks in communities across the country, from hospitals to health centers, day labor worker centers, community centers, the response locally has been so powerful and so inspiring. Like Sabi said, that, for example, I would say three things: the mutual aid, grassroots groups, families, individuals, donating money. You know, we have an immigrant worker safety net fund, and a lot of our worker centers also have local funds. You know, it's clear that the private donations aren't going to resolve this issue, but they do save lives. $100, $50, all of that literally save lives. That some of that money is literally the difference between a 70-year-old day laborer having to go back out in the cold morning at 5:30 a.m. to the day labor corner versus being able to stay indoors for as long as is necessary. It makes a big difference. And so one is that mutual assistance, that organizing at the local people taking that initiative, so powerful. That's one. Number two, it really, as much as that private assistance donations can help, it's not going to be enough unless we have cities and counties and states step in to help fill that enormous gap between immigrants and life-saving assistance. And so that means, like has been said, that can be a fund, that can be making adjustments so that they're not, for that cities and states aren't replicating the exclusions that are happening at the federal level. There's no reason to replicate that at the state level. And so that was one of the demands that day labor centers, worker centers in California were calling on Governor Gavin Newsom. You know, we know we were excluded from the federal government, but what about us in California? They would say, y nosotros qué, and that's been the hashtag they've been using, hashtag y nosotros qué. You know, what are we going to do, or what about us, right? And Gavin Newsom responded with $125 million for undocumented workers and families. Does that resolve everything? No, but those $500 that go to these workers will literally save lives. And so right now, that's the call that folks are making on many governors across the country. New York State, for example, is a very important one because it's both the epicenter, and it's also in the US, and it's also a huge population, and just in terms of numbers of people that are getting sick. The worker centers in New York City, everybody knows somebody that's been very sick. Many people know folks that have died. And so, for example, calling on Governor Andrew Cuomo in New York State to take action, that is incredibly urgent right now. And just today, actually, this morning, there is literally a caravan of essential and excluded workers that are currently encircling the State House in New Jersey, in Trenton, New Jersey, calling on Governor Murphy to step up and really say, what are you going to do in what about us in New Jersey, Governor Murphy? And so, from the public health community, from everybody on this call, that to join in that call to action for leaders in this city level and at the state level to step in and help fill that gap, that is incredibly urgent right now. And so we were, there's a lot of ideas, but definitely if folks would be interested, for example, in supporting, for example, a letter from public health experts, academics, professionals, doctors, healthcare officials, to, for example, city leaders and governors, for example, governors in the Northeast, we would very much, it's very urgent and necessary. And so if folks are interested in that kind of, taking that kind of action, we would very much support that and appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Kate.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing some of the same dynamics in North Carolina with local organizing, safety net programs, and those sort of grassroots ways of understanding where the needs are and how to fill some of these gaps. The North Carolina Justice Center has amazing resources on the various programs and how to make use of them, and what the eligibility restrictions are, and trying to address the problems with that, and Church World Service as well is doing a lot of that coalition building around community funds. There's also tomorrow a day of action focusing on immigration detention and trying to target local, your representative, and speaking out about the immense risks that face people in immigration detention and the fact that that's really not needed and that individuals have to be released. And so just increasing pressure on ICE to to limit that detention system more and more. There's coalition building going on around that. I think Detention Watch Network is leading that day of action.
Great, thank you so much. I know we're running short on time. I've been told we can go a few minutes over so that I can take a couple of questions from the audience. And I guess one of the questions that I see from the audience here is let's see, I'm trying to kind of read through the questions. One question is from someone who works on a national detention hotline. They have received many calls from foreign nationals who had signed their deportation orders and are being returned home through removal. What obligations or responsibilities does ICE have to secure both speedy deportation, but I would also add one that's secure and, you know, taking into account the pandemic and some of the contagion rates?
Yeah, I mean, supposedly ICE is following CDC guidelines. I think there's litigation about how careful that is, and certainly difficulties in getting access to testing. So, you know, I know that there have been reports of individuals being returned to their countries of citizenship who then do test positive for coronavirus and are continuing to spread that. And so making sure that those individuals, you know, are detected and cared for. But I think one of the really the travesty about this is that people sign their orders because of the conditions they're facing and that the risks they're facing. And so, you know, they're not necessarily you know, they're not necessarily going back because they think they're going to be safe there. They just think that the problem in immigration detention and currently their prospects to get out of it are you know, even riskier, and that's not where we should be.
Yeah. And I actually have another question that sort of relates to, I know there are a lot of challenges to each of you doing the work that you do given the pandemic with your respective areas of focus. What are some things, if there are public health experts or policy scholars or policy makers on this call today, what are some of the things that we can be doing as scholars and policy adjacent folks to support your work and make it easier for you? What kinds of ways can we contribute? And I will just kind of open it up to you, whoever has a response.
You know, I think in terms of advocacy, I think it's much more effective often coming from public health experts, doctors, medical professionals, hearing, you know, the dire circumstances that asylum seekers are in, the dire circumstances of detention. I think people understandably think of lawyers as advocates, which we are, and so may not be as willing to hear us when we talk about it, and are, I think, often much more receptive to hearing these same messages and concerns raised by doctors and medical and mental health professionals, public health experts. So just, you know, from a federal, state, local advocacy standpoint, I think advocacy efforts, letters, calls from all of those professionals have a huge impact and a lot of traction. And then I think on sort of the more micro level in individual cases, expert affidavits from medical, mental health professionals, public health experts about the conditions and about the risks to our clients and to asylum seekers are hugely effective in persuading individual adjudicators. So I think there are a lot of different ways that professionals can weigh in.
Thank you. I don't know if there's any other comment on that. Go ahead.
Thank you. I was going to say that it might sound a little bit silly, but in a moment like this, when part of the challenge isn't just the uncertainty and the literal health impact, the death, the health risks, it's also what's happening to us collectively in terms of the uncertainty, the fear, And in a sense, the feeling of powerlessness that individuals feel when you keep seeing what is happening over and over and over, and the failure again of our government officials, part of the challenge is really confronting and defeating that feeling of powerlessness. And so that's why spaces like this and the examples that my fellow panelists are sharing are so important, to share the good examples. We need, number one, we need more good examples, but number two, it's so important to share and to lift up and to celebrate those good examples. And so, for example, those letters, you know, if possible, we'll share the links, for example, to do it, you know, organize your own fundraiser for some of these local assistance funds, for the bond funds. You know, honestly, every effort makes a huge difference. So we'll share some links if folks can help, you know, do the fundraising. That's a big deal. But also, for example, we'll share our emails. And if folks can email us and let us know if you'd be willing to help us, for example, circulate a letter from public health experts, you know, ensuring that undocumented immigrants and workers are included in emergency relief. If folks would be interested in that, we'll share our email, and please let us know. I think part of those good examples, we need good examples of specific interventions, but also that bigger picture. If folks remember when Donald Trump read that poem about the snake, comparing immigrants to snakes, it was really just demonizing, kind of real, all of that dehumanizing that has happened over the last 3 years has an impact, and it makes it easier for politicians to rationalize that people are dying and not do anything. So we also need to challenge that. We need to challenge that, and that means celebrating mutual aid. That means celebrating the efforts to save lives. Yes, doctors and health professionals, but also the attorneys that are also in the trenches, also the day laborers that are making masks, also the, you know, the worker centers that are providing emergency relief, all of these things.
Thank you so much. I appreciate each of you being here and sharing all of this expertise and all of your deep experience in these areas with all of the audience members and with me. I have learned so much. I know we're out of time, but as Salvador said, you know, we've got our information on Science and Society. You can reach out to me, to any of the panelists through their institutions, and I'm happy to help people follow up on this in any way that can help make a difference to make sure that our immigration policies are really serving the interest of immigrants' health, but also public health at large, because as each of you have said, we're all very much interconnected. So thank you again for being here. So appreciate it. And everybody take care and be well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Meredith.